Hi, my name is Jeannie Shaw, and I am the founder of Pathways Towards Literacy, and I am the editor and co-author of the book Reading Isn't Optional: Fulfilling the Promise of Literacy for Secondary Students. And I'm incredibly excited about having the opportunity to write the chapter on oral language, speaking and listening in the secondary classroom. And what makes me was made me so excited about this chapter is because this is the work that I personally did in my own middle school classroom. And I always, as a middle school teacher, and I was always grounded in my Common Core standards of reading, writing, speaking, and listening. So every day, all my students engaged in reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And I just had incredible outcomes because all of my students, and I had the school that I worked in, I had vast majority of my students that had unfinished learning or IEPs, but every kid in my classroom was involved with the learning experience. And now, friends, I taught seventh grade ELA, right? And I want you to all to think, okay, what year was the best year of your life? And I bet many of you don't say seventh grade was it, right? So for a vast majority of all of us, right? Seventh grade was not a year we remembered. And so the reality is, I feel seventh grade is a really difficult year for a lot of kids for a variety of reasons, and more difficult in English language arts, where the kids have to sit there and engage in reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And so by me integrating my speaking standards in my classrooms every day and every unit, I created a culture in my classroom, a culture of literacy and a culture of language. And so I begin this chapter with a quote from James Britton, and I love it, right? It's called Reading and Writing Float on a Sea of Talk. And friends, we have to get our kids talking. The research is really clear, right? That in all reality, a vast majority of our kids go through the day and only have 1.7 minutes of speech production per classroom per day. That's not enough, right? And then our kids go home and they're on their screens, and they go home and they're on their screens. So if we don't get them talking in our classrooms, we're not going to improve reading outcomes, and that is clear. And so what I loved about this, with the work that I did in this chapter, right, and why this is so critical, because oral language and comprehension really have strong correlation as far as improving outcomes together. So if we want kids to really think deeply, and we want them, and there's a great chapter on writing, right, we want them to write about what they've read, then we have to get them talking about what they read using that academic language. And so in this chapter, right, I go through, why is oral language important, what the research is, and then what I think is different about this chapter than other work that we have about creating classrooms of talk, and I think it's so critical in the secondary space, is creating a culture in our classroom where our kids feel safe and vulnerable and willing to talk. Because in all reality, right, what happens when we go from middle school to secondary classrooms, there's a layer of that grows exponentially is the feeling of being judged all the time. And so for a vast majority of our kids, right, they just want to blend in. They're not going to ask questions. They're not going to speak up because they don't want to be judged by their peers. And that's why I think it's so critical in our classrooms to create this culture in our rooms where our kids feel safe. And so I give you some practical tools and some things to think about and how you can create a culture of safety in your classroom. One thing that I always did with my seventh graders is at the beginning of the year, I asked them to write down, who in the classroom do they work really, really well with, and they feel work well with, right? Just not friends with, but I work well with this person. And then who are the students in this classroom that I don't work well with? And what I always tried to do was partner kids up with at least one person they worked well with. And I never put them in a small group with someone they didn't work well with. Because if I wanted to get my students talking, I had to make sure that they felt safe. right? And the second thing that I give you really great tools around here, and I think we forget about this in our secondary space, is we forget that these are children in big bodies. And though for vast majority of our students, we do have to teach them the rules of discourse. And actually, that's a standard, friends. And so we have to teach them and not only teach them the rules of discourse, but even in my seventh grade classroom, right? I modeled them, right? I do, we do, you do. So they could see what accountable talk look like and what accountable unproductive talk look like. And so we co-created our anchor charts together and had those up in our classroom. So when it was time for speaking and listening, I always like directed their attention to what are the behaviors we're looking for when we're speaking and listening, because I'm asking them for accountable productive talk, not just a turn and talk, accountable productive talk. And so there's really good frameworks in this tech about how to integrate that. And ideally, right, this is not an English language arts classroom. These are all classrooms, right, where we have the same expectations for speaking and listening in our classroom. So once we create that community of learners, there's some really great strategies. And some of these, they've been talked about quite a bit. But I think what's fun about some of these is how you can build capacity to them. And in my seventh grade classroom, I loved using, Socratic seminar and pinwheel discussions, as well as just turn and talk. But what I'm going to challenge you with this chapter is be thinking about, okay, as I'm designing my lessons, okay, where are my targets in reading? What am I going to have them write about today? Because they got to read and they got to write. And then, friends, speaking and listening, those are standards we cannot forget. How are we integrating them not only into our daily lessons, but our weekly lessons, and to our monthly lessons, and to our long-term planning? So I really hope that you enjoy this chapter. I loved writing about it, and I hope it adds value to you and to your classroom and to your students. Because remember, reading isn't optional, and together we can fulfill the promise of literacy for secondary students. Thank you.